Welcome to Protect, Suicide Prevention Training Podcast for Healthcare Professionals. I'm Manan, consultant psychiatrist, founder, and head of faculty at Progress Guide. A very good day to our listeners. We are here again on the other side of World Suicide Prevention Day. You would have listened to John Bell in the last podcast. John gave an incredibly profound message to us all. And the message was about self-compassion, was about self-love. If you haven't heard that episode, I would strongly recommend listening to that episode. John lost his son Jake in 2020. And I asked John that with the hindsight, with the wisdom of hindsight, if he were to give himself a message in 2020, what would that message be? My question was intended in the aftermath of losing Jake, but John interpreted the question as what message he might have given himself before he lost Jake. And the message he said was, I wish I had shown myself more self-love, because if I were role modeling self-love and self-compassion, then perhaps Jake would have learned the same. And in his moment of distress, he would have shown himself that self-love, and he would have felt that it was worth it. It was one of those moments where you get goosebumps, and he broke into tears, and literally it's one of the most profound messages I've heard in my entire career, not just in this podcasting world that I have, we've done 50 episodes in. In the same vein, on the other side of World Suicide Prevention Day and Are You OK Day, we have got another person who has shown tremendous post-traumatic growth, Caroline Roodhouse. Professionally, Caroline is an internal communications consultant working across multiple industries, from education and health services to pharma and fast-moving consumer goods. She's a long-standing member of the Chartered Institute of Public Relations. Caroline enhances her skills and expertise through training, mentoring, workshops, conferences, and kind of supporting people with she has her own professional qualification in this field. In 2018, Caroline's husband of 18 years, Steve, took his own life without warning, leaving behind two young children. Caroline's journey following this tragedy led her to combine her lived experience with her communication skills to become a public speaker, where she shares a story of grief and loss to give a voice to those impacted by suicide. She has also written the book, Daddy Blackbird, the true story of a family surviving and thriving after loss by suicide. It launches on the 10th of October, 2024. And you can find more information about it at daddyblackbird.com. The complex trauma resulting from Steve's sudden suicide has defined Caroline's mission to support and empower others who have faced a similar tragedy, helping them to manage their grief, navigate the complex emotions, prioritize their own well-being, articulate their own story, and ultimately find hope again. So, listeners, Caroline Roodhouse. Welcome, Caroline, to the Protect podcast.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. And thank you for inviting me here. I'm looking forward to a really meaningful conversation with you.
So, Caroline, I know that the topic we're going to talk about today, it's quite sensitive, and I would like you to guide me through the conversation. There may be things which are red lines for you, not go, just feel free to tell me, right? So,
sure, thank you.
Because it is tough, and I'm not in your shoes, and I have no idea as to how much courage it takes to do what you are doing. So, thank you for joining us. Shall we just dive right in? into the deep end.
Absolutely, yes.
Can I get you to perhaps share with us the story of your husband's life and his struggles that led up to his tragic passing? Mate, is it okay to start there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting question, particularly off the back of what you were just saying about how comfortable people in a situation like this are with sharing things. I think that depends very much on the day and the way they're feeling at the time. And I can say for clarity there that there are times when I can speak very confidently and openly about this, and then there are other times where I feel like I'm going to cry before I've even started. So it's it's a kind of added level of complexity around not really being able to prepare that well for these sorts of conversations, but I will do my absolute best. So yes, in answer to your question, Steve had a reasonably normal upbringing. He had a brother and a sister, parents. They lived in Surrey in the UK. His dad was a banker, and his mum looked after the family at home. Steve did follow in his footsteps, his dad's footsteps, and became a banker for a while. But that was a massive contrast to Steve's personality of wanting to be free and traveling the world and spending time with friends and being quite chilled out. So that kind of career in banking did not last very long. And he went off and travelled the world and went to Australia, which was his favourite place in the world to be, and introduced Australia to me, in fact, in later years. But yeah, he was full of life, and he was a joyful person. He was very light-hearted. He was fun. I'd say he was a little bit kind of awkward at times just because he wasn't hugely confident, but that kind of added to his charm. Later in life, he became a field marketing manager when the telecoms world took off, and he was a big part of that. And he was well known by friends and colleagues for being a motivational leader, very inspirational, very kind of servant leadership style, where he really wanted to help other people to learn and grow. And they still talk about him today, and the jobs that they're in now, thanks to the support that they had from him. So there's not really much you can say about Steve that was negative or that anyone would dislike about him. He had a huge circle of friends, and he introduced me to all of those people. We were invited to go out together on a blind date, which I originally said no to. This was in the year 2000. I'd just come out of a relationship that wasn't great, wasn't up for meeting anyone new, but was very much encouraged to do so by this friend of mine and a mutual friend. And we hit it off straight away, and spent most of our time together after that, which was wonderful. He was warm and kind and trustworthy and exactly what I needed. I'd had troubles when I was younger. My dad was suffered with depression, and I came away from kind of my childhood with some difficult memories of kind of attempted suicides with my dad. But Steve was the opposite to that. He was solid, and I was drawn to him for that reason and many other reasons. Moved in with him, and we had an amazing life for a few years where we did lots of traveling. As I said, we went to Australia and lots of other places in the world. And then we did what everybody else does and started having children. And both of our girls, when we had our children, were poorly when they were younger, which I think took its toll on Steve and me. I had an accident on our honeymoon before that, in fact, which was in Australia, where I broke my spine. And suddenly Steve went from being excited new husband to caring for me 24 hours a day, which I think he found challenging, but was amazing at.
So this was like when we were chatting in the lead up to the podcast, you had mentioned that you have a connection with Princess Alexandra Hospital. This is that bit of the story, right?
It is, yes. I mean, it was the worst experience of my life, apart from the obvious breaking my spine, falling from a balcony. But I was taken by flying ambulance to the Princess Alexandra Hospital. And when I saw that that's where you were based, strangely, it brought back all these lovely, good memories of being cared for and recovering, rather than any negative memories. So thank you for that connection.
I wasn't there, but I'm sure kind of our colleagues in the spinal department, they have had a hard time actually. Because the building now is quite old and the environment is no longer fit for purpose. So every now and then I get to hear a helicopter chopper go over our building, which is a mental health building, and land on the rooftop. So I assume you would have been one of those people kind of being brought in by our trauma services.
Absolutely, I was in that helicopter one day.
Gosh.
But yeah, so that was my connection to Brisbane and the Princess Alexandra Hospital. But yeah, so going back to your original question about Steve's challenges, we had all these challenges around family. Then his dad died from a brain tumor, and the following year his mum was hit by a car and she died. Then the year after that, my dad died from lung cancer. So there was just one trauma after another. But we then got back on our feet. We had children, we got back on our feet. Things seemed to improve as far as I understood. Steve was older, a little bit quieter, knackered because we had children and we didn't sleep much, like a lot of people. And then on the 12th of November 2018, he was due to start a new role. And that's when my world was turned upside down. So we were getting ready for school and work. I was just part-time that period. I was getting my oldest daughter Evie ready for school. She was 9, Ada was 2, and Steve was getting ready to go to work. Left that morning as normal. In fact, before he left, just to kind of demonstrate his care, he was running a bit late, but I'd mentioned I had a sore throat. He went flying up the stairs to grab some throat sweets for me, and he confirmed he'd be back at 6 o'clock that evening, picking Evie up on his way home. She went to Cubs on a Monday night, and that turned into the worst kind of week of my life. I never saw him again after that moment. I was contacted by his work mid-morning to say he'd not arrived, and that's when the confusion began. I'd had no reason to believe that Steve was about to take his own life. He'd not given me any suggestion that he was suffering with any sort of mental health issues or any depression. There was no sign whatsoever, as far as I understood. I mean, I say that with all the caveats in the world because perhaps there was a sign that I didn't see. But as far as I was concerned, it was a normal day, and he went off to work. He came. He didn't. That was it. He was never seen again. And there was a police investigation looking for him. I was encouraged to report him as a missing person, which I did. But there was no sign of him anywhere, and the police were coming sort of every 12 hours to update me on the search that they were doing, which was very, very limited. There were no resources being put into this because he wasn't classed as any sort of high risk, because there was no reason to do that. I think they just thought perhaps he'd gone off on a wander and needed some space and would be back. That's pretty much what they told me. But on the Wednesday, which was 2 days after he went missing, the police car turned up outside the house, and it looked different. Sorry, I'm going to get emotional this time. It looked different this time. There was 2 of them instead of 1, and they stepped out of the car and they took their hats off and put them under their arms in a kind of sign of respect. And I could see out the window that what they were coming to say felt different to normal. And when they came inside the house, one of them took me by the shoulders and looked me in the eye and said these 15 words that I will never forget. And they said, "We found him, he's not alive, and it's clear that he's done it to himself." And that's when everything became a blur for days and weeks. And I remember parts of what came next. And I remember seeing my 2-year-old daughter drawing pictures at her little drawing table with a police officer sat drawing pictures with her. I remember my best friend and my mum being there trying to do anything to help, and feeling like they were failing miserably. But that's where we'd got to for no reason whatsoever. As far as I was concerned, I had just been told that my husband had taken his own life and I would never see him again.
Well, Caroline, I've lost someone in my extended family to suicide, and I'd spend that afternoon with my loved one, 2 hours, 3 hours, talking about world in general, politics, philosophy, all sorts of things. And I'd already begun training as a psychiatrist at that point, and I had no idea, and it leaves you with so many unanswered questions as to what must have been going on. And, grief can be an intensely personal experience. Were there some, what were some of the most challenging moments you faced?
I think that's a difficult question because, as I say, nothing was ever the same again. My whole life and my whole world and my children's world just completely transformed in that moment. So my life became unrecognizable. I describe this kind of grief because we've been through so many losses before. The difference was just palpable. I described the loss by suicide as grief with the volume turned up. It's a phrase that I picked up from one of the charities that I worked with at the time that gave us some support. And it really is, everything is just louder. And that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, for me, was these emotions that you had to make space for in your head. There was no room for anything else. There was just this loud anger and loud confusion and this deafening sadness just constantly. I remember thinking, I want to go to the cinema or somewhere where I can just be blasted with noise to kind of try and drown out this noise of all these emotions. So I guess that's one of the biggest challenges that I faced, was learning to live with the constant exhaustion that came with this fight or flight mode that you constantly found yourself in. But there were some other particular moments. I mean, the year of firsts, every anniversary. So he died in November. We then had the first Christmas to get through. We then had the inquest that was horrendous and turned up no further information. We then had his birthday, our birthdays. But I think the worst one of those kind of celebration days for me was Father's Day, because everybody else was celebrating that moment and that person in their families and their lives, and we weren't. And every year I find that a massive challenge to get through. There was another moment. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I had not clocked that actually, because I know we have different Father's Day in the UK and Australia. So this Sunday gone, so we're recording this on the 2nd of September. The 1st of September here in Australia is Father's Day. So, at work today, people were asking, oh, what did you do for Father's Day? And you kind of saying that, I've just connected the dots. I know the days are different, but that must have been, and I guess it still is every year, because your children are still quite young.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when they grow up and have children of their own, there won't be a granddad around, and they'll still have this sorrow around this day. It's never going to get easier. It just gets different, and you learn to cope with different things. But it's in your face everywhere. I mean, there's emails trying to sell you marketing stuff, and for Father's Day, you go out and there's big posters outside restaurants, book a table for Father's Day. There's constant reminders, and the kids go into school and the first activity that week is let's make a Father's Day card, and all the other kids are talking about their daddies and how he's going to be opening his Father's Day card on that morning. So it's horrendous, and I found that the worst possible celebration day. to have to cope with. Just horrific.
Yeah. I actually don't know. I'm a bit lost for words because do you mind me asking how old are your kids now?
Not at all, no. Evie is 15 now, and Ada is 8. And they're going back to school after the summer holidays.
So they would have been 2 and 9 at the time, kind of Steve passed away.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of broad difference in ages was again one of the biggest challenges that I faced, because on the day that the police had come to tell us that Steve had died, the first thing I knew I had to do was to tell Evie that Daddy was no longer missing, and he had died. And we took some advice. A friend of mine contacted an amazing charity in the UK called Winston's Wish, who gave us some words to help with that moment. And the next thing, I found myself sitting in front of Evie at 9 years old in her school, in the parents' room, which is full of leaflets about holiday clubs and books for kids and stuff like that. It's just a weird environment to be having this conversation. And I had to tell her that Daddy had died. I had to describe it in a way that she would understand at 9 years old. I was told that the most important thing is to be honest and not to kind of make up a story and hide away from the fact that it was self-inflicted, that it was suicide. Because in future, if your children do find out for whatever reason, and they're likely to, that it was suicide, and I know of so many people in this situation right now as adults finding out that what they were told was perhaps a car accident or something, in fact wasn't. The idea of losing that trust between my children and me was just too much. But yeah, I had to be honest and say what I needed to say so that Evie understood in her own way. And I told her that Daddy's brain had stopped working. He'd stopped himself from breathing and we wouldn't be seeing him again. And I was able to at least kind of talk about that understanding with a 9-year-old child who understands a little bit, thanks to education in school and things like that, around mental health and the challenges that people can face with depression and things like that, and saying that there must have been something that was making Daddy very sad that he couldn't fix. But with Ada being 2, it was a completely different situation. And I had to manage both of those different situations, and still do. I still get lots of questions from Ada that are very different, even at 8 years old now. So I followed this kind of 5-step process that I found from Winston's Wish was very helpful, around kind of just giving bits of information throughout a longer period of time and adding to that when they're ready. And like I said, that was all done in quite a short space of time with Evie, but with Ada, it's taken literally years and is still ongoing.
Because I read a post that you put in around, I assume it was Ada, kind of asking about what should she tell her friends, and kind of you had said, rather than with your 8-year-old having normal conversations, we are having very different conversations. So how do you manage a situation like that? What you said, 5 steps. Do you remember the 5 steps? Are you able to share with our listeners as to what kind of messages a parent might give to a child? Or I've got a 15-year-old and an 18-year-old, and I don't know, how do you actually share something like that? And you have actually been on the journey, and it sounds like you kind of go through that process over and over again.
Absolutely.
With your children.
Well, having children, you probably know they do ask lots of questions, and both my girls are very inquisitive, both highly intelligent and high emotional intelligence as well, which is quite handy. But then also on the flip side of that, they want to know more all the time and want to ask questions all the time. And I've had the most difficult questions to answer for Ada, and they'll come at the worst possible time, whether I'm just about to go on a work call, for example, or we're walking to school and she'll ask me, why did Daddy stop breathing? And suddenly I've got to give her some sort of response. I can't just brush that away. Things like, how come my friends have got daddies and I don't? And why are their daddy's brains working and my daddy's brains wasn't working? And all of these questions. But yeah, those 5 steps have really helped me. I can't control the questions that she's going to ask or when she's going to ask them, but that journey that I'm constantly sticking with, the first part of that was to just explain that Daddy had died. And I was given advice around it for a 2-year-old, particularly, that idea of death being final is quite hard to comprehend. So we would have to do things like, if we see a dead bird by the side of the road, we'd talk about the fact that that bird is not coming back to life and that bird's friends won't see it again, and those sorts of things to help kind of reinforce that message of the permanence, and that Daddy won't be coming back. Because on the flip side of that, again, I would have questions after Easter celebrations. Well, if Jesus came back to life, why can't Daddy? Don't we just go and help him come, or can we go and see him in heaven? Because how can we get up there to see him? And in a child's mind, all we need to do is get a unicorn and ride it up there. In reality, that's not the case, as we know. So yeah, that first step was explaining that person had died and getting that point across with subtle messages that a child would understand. The second part is giving some simple detail, and that's where I said that Daddy had stopped himself from breathing, rather than giving all of the information about the method that he used. The next one is talking about saying how Daddy decided to take his own life, and it was him that did it, rather than it being an accident or an injury or something like that. Now that kind of idea of it being a decision is a really tricky one, because we need to maybe stay away from the idea that it's a choice, because a child could then start thinking the same thing. So that's a difficult one, that it was a decision based on circumstances that he found himself in at the time. I'm not at the 4th stage with Ada yet, which is providing more information about exactly how he died. I have had to have that conversation with Evie, which again was one of the worst moments I can remember. And then the final stage is exploring those possible reasons as to why he might have felt that was the only option for him, and that kind of broader understanding of suicide more generally.
I'm actually reminded of in the suicide prevention training that we run, there is a section in the assess module called aware, and there are 2 parts to the aware chapter. And the first part of the chapter is about attitudes towards suicide, where we explore the attitudes that professionals hold towards suicide. Like, there are no right or wrong attitudes. We have attitudes, and the attitude can influence the way in which we process information or we take in information, right? So, like, I've just run a 5-day training program in Malaysia where, in an Islamic country, suicide, there are countries where suicide has been illegal not till very long back, right? So, and if you are a professional who has very strong views about this, and the person considers being in suicidal distress, is feeling judged, they won't open up. Similarly, if you believe suicide is all right, then you could miss potential opportunities where a life could be saved. So there's no right or wrong. There are different views, and it brings out different kind of. So in one of our training programs, this was a story that was related to me by someone who is a progress guide, so someone who had trained up in another organization to be a trainer. And she called me after the training event to say that one of the nurses, actually I don't remember whether it was a mental health professional, had lost a father when she was 10 years old. And she's a mental health professional now. And she kind of, like we have this thing during the training that if something really triggers you, you leave, but you indicate to the trainer that do I need support or do I not need support? So she had left in the middle of the kind of training session, and the trainer had followed this person out. And later over lunch, she kind of shared this story, her own story with the trainer that, look, I lost my father when I was 10, and I had hated my father ever since that day for being selfish.
Yeah.
So one of the attitudes we challenge is suicide is selfish or suicide is selfless, right? So, and this is for the first time ever that my paradigm of my dad being selfish has been challenged, and I found that incredibly difficult because we talk about, whatever be the reason that the person is doing it, they are doing it because of the lies that depression are telling them, or they feel that the world is better off without them, their family is better off without them. Very rarely they are doing this to inflict pain on others. They are trying to kind of get pain relief themselves and navigate out of the entrapment. They are not trying to cause anyone else pain. If anything, they feel that others are at pain because of them. And then the next day, our progress guide, she thought that she's not going to come back the next day because it's been so, triggering for her. But she came back and she said in the morning, yesterday night was the first decent night of good sleep I've had in 15 years. Wow. It was a really powerful moment. And as I was listening to that, I was thinking, oh my God. And it is a belief that she had, and I'm sure she would have been a year older than Evie when people would have had this conversation with her. Yeah. And it shows the importance of the words and the process that you used. Did you say Winston's wishes?
Winston's wish, singular.
Winston's
yes.
wish. Yeah. Winston's
Absolutely
wish.
Absolutely fantastic. And some really, really great resources. There was a booklet that they sent to me called Beyond the Rough Rock, which is specifically for children who have lost a loved one to suicide. And I remember opening it and seeing pictures drawn by children of how they understood what their parent had done to die. And it could have been a picture of a daddy hanging from a tree or a mummy jumping off a cliff or something like that in a child's drawing. And I remember thinking, I can't even look at this. And I closed it and walked away. But later, when I went back to it, and I realized that these are the methods that they use to get children to kind of process what they're going through. And these are the things that I'm going to have to face, regardless of whether I want to or not. As their parent, the one that's left behind, I need to help them. And I worked through all the difficult parts of this guide and found the bits that helped me. And that's one of the things that I would recommend actually to other people in a similar situation, is that, like you say, there's no right or wrong. So it's finding what works for you. And it took me a long time to do that. I remember when Steve first died and we were no longer a 4 with 2 adults and 2 children, where we had 4 chairs around the table and 4 seats in the car. Everything seemed to be about the number 4 to me. And then all of a sudden overnight we were 3, and I could not process that number. It was just alien to me, and nothing about that felt right. And I think even in society, it didn't felt like we were accepted as a 3 either. There was a moment where I was on the school run one morning, and there was a mum talking about, I think the conversation had turned to cars, and her car needed fixing, and she'd said, I don't need to worry about that because it's a blue job. I don't do blue jobs, I do the pink jobs. And I remember I suddenly was just in tears thinking, I do all the jobs, whatever colour they might be. I'm now responsible for all of them. And there is no kind of male role model and female role model with a mum and a dad in this family. We're just a three. And I fought and fought against this number three for so long until I realized it wasn't achieving anything. I had to accept it. And the moment that I did accept it, things transformed. And I became aware of the symbol of a triangle. And then I seemed to be seeing this everywhere. And the girls were talking about triangles in maths and things like that, and how triangles are strong and pyramids are made of triangles and they're the strongest shape in the world. And I started to see these green shoots of resilience coming from my children, and looking at our little triangle of three, and realized that we might not be this four that I thought we should be, but in fact, I can make three work. It's going to be hard. Society might have their own thing to say about that, but this is the moment that I kind of decided that I'm going to have to make this three work, and I'm going to embrace that.
So that is an incredibly powerful message to the parents, I guess. Is there anything that you'd want to say to parents who are supporting children or who have to break this kind of bad news? Is there a specific message you'd like? I think that's a beautiful message, the message of a triangle being strong and pyramids are made of triangles. That is a beautiful message to kind of get across.
It's that find your own shape, and whatever that looks like, forget about what other people's perceptions might be. Forget about what you once were, because you're not going back to that. I remember the moment in COVID, actually, where we would stand outside our houses banging out pots and pans for the NHS every, I think it was Thursday night or Monday night. And I would see all the families standing in the street, the mum, the dad, the two kids. And there was me and my two children. And I would look at them and think, why am I not like you anymore? But my message to other people now would be, don't even try to be. It won't get you anywhere. So embrace what you are now and make that work, and look at what amazing people you've got in front of you when it comes to your children, and how you can help them grow and be special individuals. And that, to me, is kind of the message I would share, is just choose your own shape and make it work.
I think for our listeners, this is an incredibly important message, because families comes in all sizes and shapes. And so Caroline's message around choose your own shape. And acceptance is not about giving up or giving in. Acceptance actually sounds like, from what Caroline is saying, leads to freedom. The freedom to be your own shape. And from freedom comes fortitude. And Caroline used a beautiful phrase over there, new shoots of resilience coming up from her children. I think that's a beautiful message. Can we talk about your book, Daddy Blackbird? So that book offers hope beyond the horror. And that was one of the things we connected on, because you had those beautiful words. Hope is a bird, like we kind of talked about Emily Dickinson, and that's how we started chatting. What inspired you to write this book, and how do you hope it will resonate with readers, especially those who have faced similar losses?
So I am a writer naturally. I love writing. I've always loved writing, and when I saw different therapists and different counselors, they would say, why don't you write some of this stuff down and get it out of your head and onto paper? And I think a lot of us know that that's quite a therapeutic process to follow. I struggled to do that. I'm not sure why, but I did find my flow eventually. And I started to realize, once I'd begun to write, that I was kind of forming chapters. One of the things that I found really restricting once Steve had died was that I wasn't able to leave the house on my own and go for a walk or a run and kind of maintain my own fitness schedule. And I found that walking around the house in circles was my only opportunity. When the girls were asleep, I'd wake up early in the morning, I'd walk around in circles, and I'd write out on my notes app on my phone how I was feeling, and I was forming chapters without realizing it. And suddenly I had about half a book written, and I just couldn't stop. But then there were moments where something would send me off course, and I'd have a challenging issue to deal with in my life, and I just couldn't write anything. So I'd have to put it down for a few weeks or months. But eventually, I, with a lot of help from a lot of volunteers through LinkedIn, who I kind of connected with, people would say, what can I do? Can I help edit your book or proofread your book, or kind of challenge you over certain sections if you want that? And I got so much help from some absolutely amazing people. And I ended up with this book, and there was only one title I could possibly choose, and that was Daddy Blackbird. And the reason for that is because shortly after Steve died, within days, I started to notice this blackbird in the back garden. Now, I'm not spiritual or religious, and I don't have a strong faith or a belief in reincarnation. But when Steve was around, he would talk about his mum when he would see this female blackbird in the back garden. He wasn't particularly religious either, but it just brought him some degree of comfort. And my mum did the same, actually, with a butterfly, when she would see a butterfly and think about her mum. And then I started seeing this little boy blackbird in our back garden. And in all honesty, because I was still very angry with Steve, and anger being my main overriding emotion, I would get quite cross when I saw this blackbird, and I would want to do bad things to this blackbird. But I wanted it to be a symbol of hope. And I would say to the girls, look, girls, there's Daddy Blackbird in the garden. Come and say hi. And they would come give him a little wave, and we'd just find comfort together, even though in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I want to throw something at you. Because this bird was complicated for me, it was bringing some sort of comfort, but then it also symbolized this freedom that I didn't have, and that perhaps I was maybe envious of Steve for now having. It was very complex, but over the following weeks and months, I started to enjoy having him around, and he would come and visit every day. And I even started to throw him bits of bread and grapes, and I peeled the little grapes for him so that his beak could get in. And he became very special. And we now have China blackbirds in the garden and in the house, and there's a lot of blackbird symbols around the house, and it became something quite important to the girls and to me. So that is why we call the book Daddy Blackbird. And you asked around what I hope the book will achieve for people. I struggled with the audiences that I was writing for, because when I started to share my story on LinkedIn, I would get a lot of people, men in particular, messaging me saying things like, reading your messages has stopped me going down this path. In fact, I've got some words written down here, actually, where I've taken some of the comments that people have written, which are quite difficult to read for me, but also I find it quite profound that I can have an impact on people struggling in this way to maybe think differently. When people would say things like it's too easy to just follow this dark hole and not be able to challenge these thoughts, when they would read something that I'd put on about how difficult it was for my girls in that particular week, they would maybe think differently because they had children of their own, and they would suddenly stop and maybe reconsider. That would be a big thing for me. And I found that writing my book was an opportunity to address that. But I also wanted to write my book for people like me, people who were struggling with losing a partner, particularly with children to support, and how that journey has evolved over time. And I structured my book for both those audiences, with a lot of help from a chap called Oliver, who offered his services for me, and he was amazing, an incredible person. And another guy called Dave, who was also brilliant, who I didn't know before this, and I'm grateful to have connected with. But we structured the book in the end into 3 sections: the history, so that people understood what Steve was like and what our relationship was like and what our family was like, and that these things can happen without any warning whatsoever. And then the horror, and the kind of year of firsts, the funeral, the kind of what I did with the ashes, all of these awful things that I had to deal with in that first year or so. And then there's the hope section, and they're all quite equal. So you can pick up the book and refer to any of those sections or all of it in one go, but you've got the choice whether you want to find out what our story was like and where we came from and where we ended up, or whether you want to know the kind of detail of what this is like and understand the reality of how a family is impacted after losing a parent to suicide or a partner to suicide. Or you can go straight to the hope section if you're somebody in a position like me where you need to find comfort and relatability from somebody else's story who has been through what you're going through now, and to feel less alone, because that's the biggest thing that people say to me in my position. I feel so alone. And I know there are help groups and forums and all sorts of charities doing amazing work to help people in this position with the postvention side of things. Sometimes you just need to know that your story actually is quite similar to somebody else's. And it might be that I'm a year ahead of them, or my children are slightly older, or they can maybe work out where they're heading, and shape their own journey around that.
Like, I'd never thought of this. Is actually quite deep. There are multiple audiences who could pick up the book. And part of me is thinking, right, so you want to capture hope. You want to end on a message of hope. So you have an entire section on hope. But at the same time, if there is a person who is in suicidal distress that you want to put off going down that path and kind of lean in, as we say, on the reasons for living rather than the reasons for dying, one could even look at the hope section and think, oh, people get on with their lives. People are okay after a while. So you would have to show incredible sensitivity in your writing and in the way because all sorts of people can pick up this book. And it's such a sensitive topic to write on.
I found that quite a difficult concept to get my head around, because I don't ever want people to think they're fine now and it's all right. And, what's the problem now? Because that's why I still share these messages around how the children still struggle. This doesn't go away. The pain doesn't go away. My loss will never go away. The children will constantly compare themselves to other kids who do have dads. And even as they get older, like I said earlier, when they have children, there won't be a granddad there who should be there. So there's a story that continues. Just because I've had to find hope and find a different way to live, it doesn't mean that we're better off without Steve, and that shouldn't have happened.
So when we are training professionals, we talk about a process by which we get people who are in suicidal distress to see beyond the end. Because and sometimes you get that feeling, you get it in your gut when people, you kind of go, oh my God, the person hasn't got any reason to live for. You're trying your hardest, and the person's story ends at like, I am dead, I am free of my pain. That's the end of my story. And I think you've just given some incredibly powerful messages around how you can get the person to see that, no, your story doesn't end there. Someone discovers you, someone relays that message, someone receives that message, someone then has to give that message to their children. Someone has explaining to do as to why we are no longer a number 4 and we are the number 3. someone has to be confronted every time Father's Day comes along or Mother's Day comes along, or as the case may be. So the story doesn't end there. And I think you've just kind of shared in a beautiful way how professionals can actually use this information and share it with people, and share it with people in a way that they can see hope. Yes, they are in pain at the moment, but this would be a way to lean on, lean in on the reasons for living. So, like just capturing Emily Dickinson's words, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. I think it's part of your book. It's a part of my book as well. It's kind of, I was on the inside cover page. And when I saw those words on your website, I kind of thought, oh, I have to get Caroline for World Suicide Prevention Day. And because, yes, we have a connection through Princess Alexandra Hospital, but we have a connection through our favorite lines as well in poetry. So
you can see the connection with the Blackbird as well. It was almost meant to be. So I'm very grateful to Emily Dickinson for writing those beautiful words, and for you for picking up on them too.
Yeah. Well, we in 2019 we had a conference in the Themes conference here in Brisbane, and I opened the conference with those words from Emily Dickinson. So when I saw that, it kind of just reminded me, it brought up a lot of memories of that conference as well. So what have been some of the key sources of strength and resilience for you over the years? Because it's been 6 years, and it's, as you said, kind of the trauma doesn't really go away. There are so many other ways in which you can get re-traumatized, even something as Father's Day, which I would never have thought of. But yeah, when you say children making cards at school, there are kind of reminders everywhere, So if you can talk to me about some sources of strength for you, and how have these helped you rebuild your life and continue forward? So I'm kind of looking for, I guess, some sections or passages from your book in the third section, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a very practical person, and I'm a realist, and I wanted that hope not to be full of fluff. I wanted it to be full of practical, useful, relatable stuff. And as I mentioned, I am a big fan of triangles, and I'm now a big fan of the number 3. So I sectioned the hope part into 3 different sections, and I call it my triangle of recovery. And the first section is the power of me. And that's where I needed to dig deep and do all the things I knew I needed to do to drag myself out of this hole that I'd found myself in after about a year after Steve died. And that involved lots of things, including therapy, looking after my mental health, also looking after my emotional health, and trying to manage my emotions and my feelings in a much more considered way, using things like CBT therapies, and mindfulness became a big part of that. Realizing that I couldn't dwell on the past and I couldn't worry about the future because I had no control over it, and looking at my children and my triangle and thinking, this is where we are now and this is what I need to focus on, and I can't do anything about the rest of it. So that was a big part, the power of me and my physical health as well. Getting back out to boot camp and going to the gym and getting stronger physically was a big part of that. The second part of my triangle of recovery was the power of my children. And I mentioned those kind of green shoots of resilience and seeing them growing and learning, and the things that Evie was doing. She wrote some words for a story where she was really troubled by some of the language that was being used at school around the topic of suicide, and it got turned into an animation, and that is now shown at schools all across the UK. It's being shared in workplaces, it's being shared in charities, in the NHS. So all about sharing this message around language that's being used. And I'm so proud of Evie for achieving this, and she's a wellbeing ambassador at school, and she goes to other schools and does assemblies about mental health. Ada is similar, doing the same, growing into an amazing young lady. So that's the second part of my triangle of recovery, is my children. And then the third part is the power of my community. And that has kind of evolved as time has gone on, starting from things like the meal train that somebody put together in the days after Steve's death, kind of members of the community, where they used this amazing little app where they could register a meal and bring it on that day. And they would just turn up on the doorstep with a hot meal and maybe a couple of toys for the children. And then the next day, somebody else from the community would turn up with a different meal. And that went on for a long time. And there were moments where, as I felt stronger, I wanted to start sharing my story, and I started tentatively sharing bits of it on LinkedIn, being the only sort of social media platform I felt comfortable and safe sharing things like that on, and finding an amazing community there of people that wanted to talk about this and hear about it. And I took a huge amount of strength from being able to share my story there, but also being able to give back and offer something to that community too. So that's really how I've shaped the things that have helped me move forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, this may be a challenging question, but we'll see how we go with it. If you could speak directly to Steve now, 6 years on, what would you say to him? And what do you think he would want to say to you and your children?
So this is a really interesting question for me, and it's not one I've been asked before. And when I first read this question, when you sent it over to me, it actually took my breath away, because I mean, the first part of your question I find quite easy to answer.
Mm-hmm.
What I would ask Steve is why, because I don't know why he did what he did. And I've learned to live with that and accept that, but I would still want to know why he's no longer here. It's the second part of your question that kind of knocked me off my feet. And you mentioned earlier about somebody who was doing their training and was suddenly facing that reality of dealing with the anger. Was it against her dad?
Dad.
And anger being the biggest issue that I've had towards Steve, which I've tried to keep away from the girls, because I don't think it's healthy for them to see that anger. They don't have anger towards Steve, and they understand the complexities of mental health. And I can feel that way towards anyone in the world apart from Steve, because I can see the pain that was caused by him dying on our children and on myself. And that anger is really, really hard to deal with. And I struggle with it every day. But when you asked me what he would say, and when I remember what an amazing person he was, I know that he would say sorry. And all of a sudden, that anger is challenged, and I'm grateful to you for making that happen.
And you know, like I did not know Steve's story before today, so I just got to know, and so I didn't know that you had seen no warning signs, nothing whatsoever. And he kind of started thinking, why? Why would he not share that he was struggling? Like I've been working in mental health for 25 odd years now, and every person's pain is unique. Every person's story is quite unique. And Yeah, hand on heart, I don't know what to expect every time I have an interaction with someone in suicidal distress. And I'm speculating here because I didn't know, Steve, you did. I wonder whether in not sharing what he was going through, was he protecting the people he loved? Um, I just wonder whether is that what he would, because if you asked him why, and why would you not give us a chance to help you? Did he believe he was beyond help and he didn't want to drag his whole family down with him? And that was the thing that we often in our section on attitudes to suicide, where we look at things like, suicide is cowardice or suicide takes courage. Like we look at these very difficult questions, and we all have preconceived notions about suicide. And this year's World Suicide Prevention Day topic is changing the narrative,
Yes.
and kind of starting to have conversations about suicide. And you kind of think, only if, what if he would have given you a window, a glimpse? And this is a question I asked myself about my loved one as well. There was no window. There were lots of windows. I didn't spot them, but how could we get to a place? How could we create communities where communities create space and hold space for people to share their emotional distress, and it's okay to be able to talk about pain? And that's the narrative that we need to change if we can challenge the stigma. This is not weakness. There is something biochemical going on in your brain as well. We won't react in this way if this was diabetes or hypertension or Parkinson's or epilepsy. We would get the person treatment and help and support. Why doesn't the same thing apply to conditions, other conditions, mental health conditions, which are equally dangerous and fatal? And that's about changing that conversation.
Absolutely. I think that raising awareness around that theme is a really important point that you make, because it's part of the reason why I do what I do, as well as helping people in my position to feel less alone. I feel that I'm helping people in Steve's position to stop and maybe ask themselves some of those questions and give themselves a moment just to stop, because that's what I'm being told by many, many people is what's happening when they read my posts and the things that I share. And it's perhaps creating that window, like you say, or going some way to helping create that window where there's a moment to reflect.
Yeah. Because, that post that you put about your daughter asking, how should she explain that to her friends? 6 years on, the story lives on, right? He may be gone, but the impact on the family carries on. And that, I think reading a post like that would make someone stop for a moment and go, whoa, this is 6 years on.
Absolutely. And I intend to keep them coming, because it's going to be 7 years on, and it's going to be 8 years on, and there will be new challenges, and I'll keep sharing them, because until somebody tells me that it's not helpful, I think it's something that I owe it to people to do.
We cannot control how people respond to messages, but I do think, like, as a mental health professional, every post that I've read of yours, it has made me think, actually, it's incredibly powerful. It will make someone go, pause and think for a moment. And you're creating that moment of pause. And in that moment of pause, if you can get people to rewind and kind of look for the reasons of living, and he had plenty of reasons for living. Unfortunately, in his case, no one hit the pause button.
Absolutely.
Now, this is not a question I have sent to you, but it's the same question that I asked John in the previous podcast about, if you were to give a message to Caroline of 2018 with all the wisdom that Caroline of 2024 has got. And you can do it kind of pre-losing Steve or post-losing Steve, or maybe you can, there are two different messages. What message might that be?
I think it would be post losing Steve, because I can't put myself back in a position before that. But it would be around this message of hope and reshaping my life, and not trying to kind of mold that four, but put that four aside and embrace that three and that triangle shape, and be grateful for the things that I do have rather than the things that I don't have, and remind myself that my children deserve a strong and happy and contented parent, and to do everything that I possibly can to be that person, regardless of what we've been through.
So it's a message of acceptance around, around the three, rather than fighting for the four, because the
Yes.
four, reality is what it is, and fighting reality does not change reality. If anything, it turns pain into suffering. Suffering comes from fighting reality, and again, that's an incredibly powerful, and kind of rejecting reality or denying reality. It's a bit like a cloud around reality, and things that are difficult to see are difficult to solve. And there's something quite liberating around freedom in terms of acceptance that allows you to ground and move forward. And you mentioned that mindfulness was a large part of your hope and healing, and that journey that you had. Yeah. What are your hopes for the future in terms of suicide prevention and awareness, both at a personal level and kind of the work that you have been doing as an advocate? Do you have particular hopes for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things I've recognized is that there's something quite special about the people that operate in this area, who have been touched by suicide and who feel the need to go out and talk about it and try to do something about it. And my life has changed for the better, having connected with this community of people, and it continues to do so every day. So from a personal perspective, I want to strengthen those connections, give as much as I can to this community, and continue to meet more of these incredible people. I think from a broader perspective, when it comes to seeing the work of suicide prevention actually making a difference, there's a limit to what I can achieve, and I accept that. But what I know makes a difference is sharing my story, sharing the details with honesty, and being raw and open and filtering nothing. So my intention is to continue doing that, so that as we spoke about earlier, we can perhaps create more of those moments of pause for people, to reconsider perhaps a journey that they were intending to take.
Yeah. Like John talked about, so he founded the charity called Walking for Hope, and he talks about putting one foot in front of another. Just keep, and that's how he said his journey of hope and healing started, by putting one foot in front of another. Just keep taking the next step and the next step. And it sounds like in your case, it's been just keep writing the next word and the next sentence and the next paragraph and the next chapter. So it goes. So, in terms of spreading the word, it's actually quite incredible, the work that you're doing, and giving people a moment of pause. I think I've heard some incredibly powerful messages today around the triangle and find your own shape, and practical tips and guidance, which it seems like from your book, Daddy Blackbird, I'm kind of waiting for its release, kind of 10th of October, that people will get, families who are on their own recovery journey, people who are struggling. Sounds like a must read for people, and it's shaped on the triangle as well, which is quite incredible. And so, Caroline, I can't believe that we have been chatting for almost an hour and a half. Like, time's just flown by, and exchanging these kind of deep, meaningful messages from you. And it sounds like you managed to kind of shift the narrative in your head from what's the matter with you to what matters to you. You know, like you kind of really got to what matters to you are your children, and having a strong parent, and for them, they deserve a strong parent. And you have recreated your life around that. I'm not in your shoes, so I can't even begin to imagine how much courage your journey would have taken, or how much courage it takes to stand up and speak every time you do this. The courage, the fortitude, the resilience, the message of hope and healing. It's incredible. Like, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking this time out, and on World Suicide Prevention Day around this week, kind of coming on for Protect Podcast and spending time with us. Is there a final message that you would want to give to our listeners?
Thank you. I think that's a beautiful summary, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak to you. I think the final message would be one of demonstrating kindness. We have ups and downs in life, conscious that everybody faces those, and it's been a particularly challenging time for me recently, but there are people that have shown me such immense kindness, not just this week, but for a long time now, and I'm grateful to those people, and they have made all the difference to me. And I know that I can do the same for other people. I know that I can show kindness to others, and I can show kindness to myself. And I think if we're all a bit more conscious of the power that we have when it comes to just considering other people and being human beings and showing kindness, I think the world would look quite different.
Like we didn't plan this part at all. Like we've had a sequence of people giving the same message, actually. So we had Stan Steindl, who is a compassion-focused therapist. He's a stalwart in that field, talk about self-compassion. And then we had John Bell come and talk about self-compassion and kindness. And now Caroline Roodhouse giving the same message about kindness, allowing oneself to receive kindness from others as well, returning that kindness. Often people are really good at giving kindness to others, but not so good at allowing others to be kind to themselves, showing yourself the self-compassion. And that is an incredible part. I think that's an incredibly important part of changing the narrative that we have been talking about, like be kind to yourself. And people who are in emotional pain, they might feel like giving up or giving in, and the reasons for dying might give you lots of reasons to get that pain relief in a quick way, but then there is an entire story that is left behind of people who are left behind. And your act of kindness towards yourself can actually save many other people a lot of pain down the road as well. So take a moment to pause, be kind to yourself. And those people who are kind of on the road to recovery, whether that be of themselves from suicidal distress or they have lost a loved one to suicidal distress, allow others to be kind to yourself, be kind to yourself as well. And he used a beautiful phrase from one of the charities he mentioned, grief with volume turned up. And often if that harsh voice is very loud in your head, find ways to just turn the volume down a little bit. You can't change the channel because of the way you are on, what you're going through in life, but maybe through acceptance and through kindness and through gratitude, you may be able to turn the volume down. Thank you, Caroline, so much for your wisdom and sharing it with all the listeners. Thank you so much.
Thank you.